There is a version of this story Hollywood has already told you. Neon lights, double-breasted suits, wise-cracking hitmen, criminal nobility, the kind of story that makes you root for the wrong people. This is not that story. This begins on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, in the most densely packed neighborhood in the history of the Western world. It involves a man born in the gutter who built real power, the kind that buys police commissioners, controls elections, and decides who lives and who dies. It involves between 75 and 150 murders, ordered with the calm efficiency of a corporate executive managing a staffing problem. His name was Louis Buchalter. Everyone called him Lepke. He was small, quiet, and almost impossible to notice in a room, and he understood that was his greatest weapon. He ran the labor rackets of New York City for 20 years. He turned Murder Incorporated into an industrial killing machine. He was the only organized crime boss in American history ever executed by the state. Netflix won't tell you this story, not because it's too violent, because it implicates systems, the police, the courts, the politicians, the unions that still exist. The Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1897 was the most densely populated place on Earth. More than 300,000 people lived in a square mile of tenements and pushcarts and cobblestone streets, most of them Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants from Russia, Poland, Romania, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all of them fleeing variants of the same thing. The pogroms, the economic exclusions, the legal disabilities, the casual and systematic violence that Jewish life in Eastern Europe had meant for centuries. They arrived at Ellis Island with whatever they could carry and were deposited into a neighborhood that had no room for them but absorbed them anyway, the way cities absorb people when the alternative is death at sea. The tenements were 4 and 5 stories of brick and wood, each floor subdivided into apartments of 2 or 3 rooms, housing 2 or 3 families. The streets below were permanently crowded, vendors, workers, children, delivery wagons, the constant noise and press of a population, living at too close a range for anything to remain private. You knew your neighbor's business because there was no physical space between their business and yours. Louis Buchalter was born into this world on February 6, 1897. He was the youngest of 11 children, born to Barnett and Rose Buchalter, immigrants from Russia who had been in America long enough to have established a modest hardware store on the Lower East Side. The hardware store was a legitimate business, and it made the Buchalters modestly more comfortable than many of their neighbors. Not prosperous, but not entirely desperate. Barnett Buchalter was a steady, hard-working man who believed in the immigrant compact. Work hard, be honest, raise your children to be Americans. He died when Louis was 13. The death of Barnett Buchalter in 1910 was the pivot on which Louis's life turned. The hardware store couldn't support the family without him. The older siblings scattered to different cities, to different lives, to whatever opportunities had presented themselves in the decade and a half since the family had arrived in America. Rose Buchalter moved to Arizona, where one of her daughters had settled. She took the younger children with her, all except Louis. Louis stayed in New York. He was 13 years old, alone, with no particular direction from the family that had just dissolved around him, in a neighborhood where the opportunities available to a 13-year-old boy with no adult supervision and no income were not unlimited. He did what kids in his situation did. He ran with the street gangs. He committed small crimes. He was caught for some of them and not caught for others. He developed the specific practical intelligence that accrues to people who have to solve survival problems with insufficient resources. His first arrest was in 1912. He was 15 and was picked up for theft. The specifics varied by account, but the broad fact was consistent. He served a brief sentence and was released. The arrest didn't redirect him. It was, in the context of his neighborhood and his situation, a normal experience. Half the boys he knew had similar records. The ones who went on to become legitimate citizens were mostly the ones whose family situations were more stable, who had adults in their lives to provide structure and direction and alternative opportunities. Louis Buchalter had none of these things. What he had, increasingly, was a talent for the specific kind of organizational thinking that criminal enterprises require. He was not physically imposing. He was slightly built, 5'7", with a quiet, watchful manner that people who met him later in life consistently described as unremarkable in the best possible way. He didn't project menace. He didn't grandstand. He thought carefully before he spoke and spoke precisely when he did. These qualities, which in another context might have made him an excellent middle manager or attorney, made him, in the context of the Lower East Side criminal economy, extremely valuable. The Lower East Side criminal economy of the 1910s was not an organized enterprise. It was a collection of overlapping crews, gangs, and individual operators pursuing various forms of theft, extortion, gambling, and prostitution in an environment that was simultaneously competitive and cooperative, with alliances that formed and dissolved based on opportunity and threat. The larger Jewish gangs, the Monk Eastman gang, had been the dominant force until Eastman himself went to prison in 1904, had given way to a more fragmented landscape in which smaller crews operated semi-independently. The key figure who shaped this landscape and who shaped Louis Buchalter's trajectory more than anyone else was Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein was a different kind of criminal. He was educated, polished, the son of a respected businessman, raised in upper-middle-class Jewish Manhattan rather than the tenements of the Lower East Side. He had taken the organizational and financial intelligence of his legitimate background and applied it to criminal enterprises with results that were extraordinary. He was the preeminent fixer in New York by the early 1910s, the man who could arrange bail, buy off witnesses, reach judges, and finance operations too large for individual criminals to fund independently. He was, in the term that would become standard, the criminal banker, the person who provided capital and connections to the emerging world of organized crime in exchange for a percentage of the returns. Rothstein saw in the young Buchalter what Buchalter's more spectacular contemporaries lacked: discretion, patience, and organizational capacity. The flamboyant criminals, the ones who drove expensive cars and wore flashy clothes and made themselves visible, were useful for certain purposes and catastrophically exposed for others. Rothstein preferred people who operated in the background, who accumulated power without accumulating profiles. Louis Buchalter, quiet and watchful and almost invisible in a room, was exactly this type. Under Rothstein's mentorship, Buchalter developed the strategic orientation that would define his criminal career. He was not interested in robbery or gambling or prostitution, the traditional criminal enterprises. He was interested in labor racketeering, in the systematic extraction of money from industries through the control of their workers and their supply chains. This was a more complex enterprise than simple crime, requiring relationships with union officials, business owners, and politicians simultaneously. It was, in effect, a business rather than a crime, which is exactly how Buchalter thought about it. The specific insight Buchalter developed, and it was genuinely his, however much it drew on the broader environment of New York criminal innovation, was that the control of labor unions gave you a chokehold on entire industries, not just individual businesses. If you controlled the truckers, you controlled the delivery of every product those trucks moved. If you controlled the workers, you could shut down any business that failed to cooperate with your demands. If you controlled both the workers and the deliveries, you controlled the industry itself, and the industry would pay you whatever you asked rather than face the alternative. He began in the garment industry, which was both the largest employer of Jewish workers in New York and the most heavily unionized. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU, and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America represented hundreds of thousands of workers, and the union structures, particularly the shop-level locals, were deeply embedded in the day-to-day operations of the garment factories. A man who could control those locals could control those factories. Buchalter's approach was not the crude muscle approach of earlier labor racketeers. He was systematic. He identified the key positions within the union structures, the local presidents, the shop stewards, the business agents who handled the day-to-day labor relations between workers and management. And he placed his people in those positions, or co-opted the people already there. He used violence selectively and strategically, not as a first resort, but as the enforcement mechanism that made everything else possible. The threat of violence, credible, demonstrated, and efficiently deployed, was more useful than the constant application of violence which attracted attention and created enemies. By the early 1920s, Louis Buchalter, now universally called Lepke, a Yiddish diminutive meaning Little Louis, was a significant figure in the New York underworld. He had a partner named Jacob Gurra Shapiro, a physically imposing enforcer whose brute strength and tactical ferocity complemented Lepke's organizational intelligence. Together they were Lepke and Gurra, and by the mid-1920s, their combined operation was generating substantial income from the garment industry, while extending tentacles into other industries. The nickname Lepke stuck for reasons that were both affectionate and appropriate. He was, by all accounts, a small man who projected a peculiar kind of authority, the authority of someone who never needed to raise his voice because he never needed to. The threats he made were not personal or emotional. They were statements of business fact. This is what will happen if you do not cooperate. The absence of emotion was more frightening than any amount of theatrical menace. His personal life was, for a gangster, unremarkable. He married a widow named Betty Wasserman in 1927 and adopted her son Harold. He lived in a modest apartment on the Upper West Side, then in better apartments as his income increased, but never in the ostentatious style of other mob figures. He was home for dinner. He did not keep a mistress. He did not gamble. He did not make public scenes or draw attention to himself in any of the ways that made many of his contemporaries easy targets for law enforcement. He was, within the logic of his profession, a professional. He was also a murderer, and the scale of his murdering was, by the early 1930s, moving well beyond anything that could be described as business necessity and into territory that can only be described as the institutionalization of killing as an organizational tool, the organization that would become known to the press and eventually to history, as Murder Incorporated was not created by a single decision or a single person. It grew through the late 1920s and into the 1930s from the practical needs of the emerging national crime syndicate. The organized alliance of criminal groups that the 1929 Atlantic City Conference of Major Crime Figures had begun to formalize, and that the violence of the Castellammarise War and its aftermath had accelerated. The problem that Murder Inc. solved was an ancient one in any large criminal organization. What do you do when someone needs to die, and the killing needs to be both reliable and deniable? In a small local operation, the boss could arrange the killing directly, using people he knew personally, in a context where the chain of responsibility was visible to everyone involved, and the mutual obligation of silence was enforced by proximity and shared stakes. In a national organization involving dozens of independent criminal groups in cities across the country, this model broke down. You needed a specialist service, people who would do the work reliably, who had no personal connection to the victim or the victim's associates, and who could be managed at arm's length. The solution that emerged from the meetings between Lepke Buchalter, Albert Anastasia, and the leadership of the Brownsville and East New York Jewish and Italian gangs in the early 1930s was, in structural terms, a staffing agency for murder. The operative unit, based primarily in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn, the predominantly Jewish working-class neighborhood that had produced a generation of hard, capable criminal operatives, employed somewhere between 24 and 50 active killers, depending on the period and the source. They were supervised by Anastasia and a Brownsville boss named Abe Reles, and they were tasked with homicides ordered by the syndicate leadership, of which Lepke was the dominant figure. The operating procedures of Murder Inc. were, by the standards of contemporary corporate practice, impressively well designed for their purpose. Assignments came down through insulated chains of communication. The man who ordered the killing was never in direct contact with the men who performed it. Payment was made through intermediaries. The killers traveled to other cities for contracted hits, which meant they had no personal connection to the victim and no social network in the victim's environment that could generate witnesses or informants. When possible, the bodies were disposed of, buried in quicklime in the New Jersey marshes, dropped in weighted bags in the East River, burned in furnaces, rather than left to be found. The principal killers of Murder Inc. have become, in a certain strand of American true crime culture, figures of dark fascination. Abe Reles was the most important of them, operationally, a physical brute with an exceptional memory for operational detail and a tactical intelligence that made him enormously effective. Harry Strauss, known as Pittsburgh Phil, was by most accounts the most prolific killer in the organization's history. Estimates of his personal kill count range from 20 to over 100, the uncertainty reflecting the same evidentiary problems that characterize all estimates of Murder Inc.'s total body count. Frank Abandando, Happy Maione, Vito Gurino, Charles Workman, these men were not theatrical criminals of the Hollywood type. They were workers, in the most disturbing possible sense of the word. People who showed up, did a job, and went home. The distinction between Murder Inc. and ordinary gangland violence was not the violence itself, but its systematization. Gangland killings had always been part of the criminal landscape in New York. What Lepke and Anastasia built was something different, a defined organizational structure, a standardized operating procedure, a management hierarchy, and a client base that extended across the entire national crime syndicate. Murder Inc. killed people not just for the New York families, but for operations in New Jersey, Chicago, Detroit, and elsewhere. It was, in effect, a national service provider in a specific professional category. The business model required what all service businesses require: reliability and quality control, a killing that was botched, a victim who survived, a witness who was left alive, a body that was found too quickly, was a business failure with serious consequences. Reelers enforced quality standards with the same seriousness that a corporate manager would enforce delivery timelines. Operatives who made errors were reviewed. Repeated failures had consequences. The scale of Murder Inc.'s operations has been debated by historians since the 1940s, when the organization was first exposed in detail. The most commonly cited figure for the total number of murders committed by the organization between roughly 1931 and 1941 is somewhere between 75 and 150. Some researchers place the number higher. The uncertainty is irreducible. By design, many of the killings were never attributed to the organization. Many of the victims were never identified, and many of the bodies were never found. What can be said with confidence is that the organization functioned continuously for approximately a decade, that it operated across multiple states, that it killed people of many different backgrounds and for many different reasons, and that it did so without significant law enforcement disruption. Until the chain of events that began with Abe Relis's decision to cooperate with prosecutors in 1940. Lepke's specific role in Murder Inc. was the highest level 1. He was the primary client and the primary management authority. He ordered killings. He approved them. He sometimes overruled them when he calculated that a particular death would attract more attention than it was worth. He managed the relationship between the Murder Bureau and the broader crime syndicate with the same organizational intelligence he applied to his labor rackets. The distinction he maintained between Lepke, the labor racketeer, and Lepke, the murder organizer, was not really a distinction at all. The murders served the labor rackets. A businessman who refused to pay was a businessman who might also talk to prosecutors or organize other businessmen to resist, or go to the newspapers. Eliminating the businessman eliminated those possibilities. A union official who developed a conscience about the organization's practices was a union official who might do the same. Eliminating him eliminated the risk. The murders were not separate from the business. They were the enforcement mechanism that made the business possible. This integration of violence and economic coercion into a single operating system is what distinguishes Lepke's empire from ordinary gangland violence. It is also what makes it the most direct historical predecessor of the protection racket economy that the American mob would operate for the next half-century. The model Lepke built: control the labor, control the supply chain, use violence to enforce compliance, use political corruption to insulate the operation from law enforcement, is exactly the model that the Italian-American crime families would refine and extend through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s in industries ranging from construction to waste hauling to the waterfront. He built the template. Others used it for generations. The corruption that sustained Lepke's empire was not incidental to it. It was structural. Without the systematic purchase of police officials, prosecutors, judges, and politicians, the operation could not have functioned for a week, let alone for 2 decades. The specific mechanisms of that corruption, who was bought, how they were paid, what they provided in return, constitute one of the most thoroughly documented cases of institutional corruption in American history. Documented because the eventual prosecutorial investigations that brought the empire down required and produced extensive records. The New York Police Department of the 1920s and 1930s was not a corrupt institution in the sense of being uniformly corrupt from top to bottom. It was corrupt in the more complex and more common way of institutions that contain honest people and dishonest people in proportions that shift over time, in which the dishonest people exercise disproportionate influence because corruption is a self-reinforcing system. A corrupt precinct captain can ensure that honest officers are transferred or disadvantaged. A corrupt district commander can protect corrupt precinct captains from oversight. A corrupt police commissioner can protect corrupt district commanders. The system tends toward corruption when the external pressure for integrity is insufficient to overcome the internal pressures that corruption generates. The Tammany Hall political machine, which dominated New York City politics from the mid-19th century through the mid-20th, was the political infrastructure that made this kind of systematic police corruption possible. Tammany controlled the mayoralty, the city council, the district attorney's offices, and the appointments of police and judicial officials. It collected money from organized crime in exchange for protection from law enforcement. This was not a secret. It was widely understood, periodically documented by reform investigators, and persistently functional, because the reformers who exposed it were unable to sustain the political coalitions necessary to replace it with something different. Lepke's relationship with Tammany Hall was mediated through a series of fixers and intermediaries, people whose job was to translate criminal money into political protection without either side having to directly acknowledge the transaction. The key intermediary in Lepke's case during the 1920s was a figure named Jimmy Hines, a Tammany district leader from Harlem, who operated as one of the organization's most capable political brokers. Hines managed relationships with criminal enterprises, most famously with the Dutch Schultz numbers operation, but also with Lepke's labor rackets, and provided protection from law enforcement in exchange for payments that were substantial and regular. The protection Hines provided was real and specific. Police officers who were positioned to interfere with Lepke's operations were transferred. Arrests that were made were managed through the bail and prosecution systems to produce outcomes that didn't endanger the operation. Grand jury investigations that were getting too close were steered away from the most sensitive areas. This required Hines to maintain relationships with the district attorney's office and with key judicial figures, and he did so through the same combination of political patronage and direct payment that characterized all his operations. The police department had its own separate corruption infrastructure that didn't require Hines as an intermediary. Precinct-level corruption, the payment of weekly or monthly stipends to precinct commanders and detective squad supervisors in exchange for advance warning of raids, suppression of arrests, and interference with investigations, was a routine cost of doing business for Lepke's labor extortion operations. The amounts involved were not trivial. Court records from subsequent investigations documented payments to individual police officials, ranging from a few $100s per month to several thousand, substantial sums in Depression-era dollars. The corruption extended to the courts in ways that are, from a contemporary perspective, almost inconceivably brazen. Judges who could be reached in advance of jury selection were reached. Bail bondsmen who were connected to the organization arranged bail conditions that made flight easier when necessary. Prosecutors whose ambitions could be managed through support for their political careers, through direct payment, through the threat of exposure, were managed. The system was not infallible. Occasionally cases went wrong. Occasionally prosecutors who couldn't be managed won convictions. Occasionally the political protection failed. But the rate of failure was low enough, and the management of the failures sophisticated enough, that the operation continued for 2 decades with only moderate interruption. The labor unions that were the direct instrument of Lepke's extortion were themselves deeply embedded in the Democratic Party political structure that Tammany controlled. Many of the union officials who cooperated with Lepke, some under coercion, some as willing partners in the extraction, were also Tammany political operatives, people whose union positions and political connections reinforced each other. This created a seamless integration of criminal, labor, and political power that was extremely difficult to attack from any direction. An investigation of the criminal element ran into political protection. An investigation of the political element ran into union protection. An investigation of the union element ran into both. The business owners who paid Lepke's levies were, in most cases, not entirely passive victims. They were participants in a system that they had accepted because the alternative, resistance, was costly in ways they were not willing to bear. Many of them rationalized their participation in ways that business people have always rationalized accommodation with power. The payments were a cost of doing business, no different in principle from any other regulatory burden, and the stability that the labor peace provided was worth the price. This rationalization was self-serving and morally corrupting, but it was also not entirely irrational. For a garment manufacturer paying Lepke $10,000 a year, the alternative, extended labor unrest, damaged facilities, disrupted supply chains, physical threats, was genuinely more expensive. The corruption of institutions, police, courts, political organizations, trade unions, was not merely a support system for Lepke's criminal enterprise. It was the criminal enterprise's most important product. What Lepke sold to the industries he controlled was not simply labor peace. It was immunity from the normal operations of legitimate authority. You paid Lepke, and in exchange you were left alone. Not just by him, but by the police and the prosecutors and the politicians who were on his payroll. This was a more comprehensive protection than any legitimate institution could offer. And it was priced accordingly. The social infrastructure that sustained this system was the neighborhood, Brownsville, the East New York section of Brooklyn, the Lower East Side of Manhattan. These were communities in which the criminal organizations were embedded in family networks, in synagogue congregations, in the social clubs and Democratic Party clubs that organized the political life of working-class Jewish New York. The criminal figures were not outsiders imposing themselves on the community. They were, in many cases, respected members of the community. People who gave money to local charities, who attended the same synagogues as the families of the men they occasionally ordered killed, who were known by their first names to the storekeepers and the rabbis' wives and the mothers of the boys who ran their errands. This community embeddedness was not a moral shield. It didn't make the murders less murderous or the extortion less extractive. But it was a practical shield. Witnesses who might have spoken to law enforcement were witnesses who lived in the same buildings as the people they might testify against, whose children went to school with the children of those people, whose economic and social lives were intertwined with the community that the criminal organization helped to define. Silence was not just a product of fear. It was a product of loyalty, obligation, and the rational calculation that speaking to outside authorities would destroy social relationships that had value. The result was a criminal empire that was, for most of its operational life, remarkably stable, generating substantial income for its principals, providing a degree of order and predictability to the industries it controlled, and maintaining the political relationships that insulated it from prosecution. It was, by the standards of its time and its environment, a successful enterprise. Its success and its methods made it the direct ancestor of everything that organized crime in America became for the next 50 years. The industrial scale of Lepke's extortion operations during the 1930s is best understood through the specific industries he controlled, because the numbers are staggering in their implications, and because the specificity of the control tells you something that general descriptions of labor racketeering cannot convey. The garment industry was the foundation. New York City in the 1930s manufactured approximately 40% of the clothing sold in the United States, and the garment industry employed roughly 300,000 workers in the city, the large majority of them Jewish and Italian immigrants and their children. The industry's structure: hundreds of small manufacturers, a complex network of subcontractors, a heavily unionized workforce organized through the ILWU and the Amalgamated, was precisely the structure that Lepke's model exploited most effectively. His control of the garment industry operated at multiple levels simultaneously. At the manufacturer level, he collected tribute, weekly or monthly payments that were described in the records that eventually reached prosecutors in amounts ranging from $100 to several $1,000, depending on the size of the operation. The payments bought labor peace, no strikes, no work slowdowns, no problems with supply deliveries. For a garment manufacturer operating on thin margins in a depression economy, labor peace was worth a great deal, and Lepke's price, however extortionate, was often less than the cost of genuine labor disruption. At the union level, he controlled the local officers, the shop stewards and local presidents who had the day-to-day authority to call strikes, certify grievances, and interpret contract provisions. These officials were either on Lepke's direct payroll or operated under the credible threat of violence if they failed to cooperate. Their cooperation meant that workers who tried to organize genuine resistance to the criminal influence in their unions were dealt with through the union's own internal processes rather than through legitimate advocacy. The union structure, designed to protect workers, was used instead to suppress the workers who most needed protection, the ones trying to resist the criminal control of their own organizations. At the trucking level, the delivery infrastructure that moved raw materials into the factories and finished goods out. Lepke controlled the teamster locals that organized the drivers. A manufacturer who refused to pay could find that his deliveries stopped, that the drivers' union declared a dispute that had nothing to do with actual labor conditions, but everything to do with the manufacturer's non-payment of tribute. The delivery stoppage was, in a manufacturing environment, a production stoppage. You cannot make garments without fabric, and you cannot sell garments you cannot ship. The numbers that eventually emerged from prosecutorial investigations suggested that Lepke's garment industry operations were generating somewhere between $5 and $10 million per year at the peak of the 1930s. An almost incomprehensible sum in Depression-era terms, representing the equivalent of tens of millions in contemporary purchasing power. This money did not go only to Lepke. It supported a substantial organizational infrastructure, provided income for union officials and business agents on the payroll, funded the political corruption payments, and financed the enforcement operations. But a significant portion went to Lepke and his principal associates. The bakery industry was a secondary empire that illustrated how Lepke's model extended beyond its initial base. The bakers' unions in New York organized the workers in the commercial bakeries that supplied bread and baked goods to the city's 5 million residents. Control of the bakers' unions gave Lepke leverage over the bakery owners, who were organized into their own association, and whose cooperation he purchased through the same combination of threats and practical benefits that characterized the garment industry arrangements. The bakery operations were smaller than the garment industry, but operated on the same principles. The flour trucking industry. The delivery of flour to the commercial bakeries was perhaps the most complete monopoly Lepke established. He controlled the flour trucking association so thoroughly that no truck could legally deliver flour to a New York City bakery without going through his organization. The tribute he collected from this monopoly position was proportionally very high. Bakeries paid a premium for every hundredweight of flour they received, a tax on the basic raw material of their business that they could not avoid without closing entirely. The amount generated by flour trucking alone was estimated by prosecutors in the hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. The motion picture projection industry was the most dramatic extension of Lepke's model into unexpected territory. Movie theaters employed projectionists who were organized into Local 306 of the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, IATC. Lepke's organization had placed its people in the leadership of this local, and through that control exercised leverage over the theater owners whose projectionists they employed. A theater without projectionists cannot show films. A theater that cannot show films has no business. The tribute that theater owners paid to maintain the flow of projectionists to their screens was a direct tax on the entire movie exhibition business in New York City, paid ultimately by the movie-going public in the form of higher ticket prices. The fur manufacturing industry provided another variant of the same model. The fur business in New York in the 1930s was substantial. The city was the center of American fur manufacturing and retailing, and the workers were organized through the International Fur Workers Union. Lepke's control of the fur workers' union leadership gave him leverage over the fur manufacturers through the same labor peace mechanism. Pay the tribute or face disruption. The fur business was particularly vulnerable to this pressure because the product was perishable in the reputational sense. Delays in manufacturing for a fashion-sensitive product could result in missed retail seasons and permanent customer losses. Across all of these industries, the operating mechanism was the same. Control of organized labor, combined with the credible threat of violence, enabled the extraction of tribute from business owners who could not resist without facing costs that exceeded the tribute itself. The organizational sophistication required to maintain this system across multiple industries simultaneously, keeping track of which businesses were current in their payments, managing the enforcement actions for delinquent accounts, coordinating the political protection payments, supervising the murder bureau that handled the most serious enforcement problems, was considerable. Lepke managed it with the systematic attention to organizational detail that had characterized his approach since the beginning. He had people, middle managers, in effect, responsible for specific industries or geographic areas. He had accounting systems informal but functional, that tracked payments and arrears. He had communication protocols that insulated him from direct contact with the most operationally risky activities. The organizational intelligence that had made him attractive to Rothstein in the 1920s was fully deployed in managing an enterprise of this scale. The victims of this system were numerous and of several different kinds. The most obvious victims were the business owners who paid tribute, not because their suffering was equivalent to the suffering of the people who were murdered, but because they are the most quantifiable category. Hundreds of businesses in the garment, bakery, trucking, theatre and fur industries paid Lepke's organization over the course of the decade. The aggregate amount extracted was almost certainly in the tens of millions of dollars in Depression-era money. The less obvious victims were the workers whose unions had been corrupted, the workers in the garment factories, the bakeries, the movie theaters, the fur shops. They were members of organizations that were supposed to represent their interests, but instead represented Lepke's. Genuine grievances went unaddressed. Opportunities for genuine wage improvements were sacrificed to maintain the labor peace that the criminal arrangement required. Workers who tried to use the union's mechanisms to address real problems found those mechanisms inoperative or actively hostile. The trade union movement, which had been built through decades of sacrifice by genuinely committed organizers and activists, was hollowed out from the inside in the industries. Lepke controlled, and then there were the people who died. The murders that Murder Inc. carried out on Lepke's behalf were not random. They were, in the terrible logic of the enterprise, rational. They were the enforcement mechanism for the economic system. A businessman who stopped paying and had also expressed willingness to speak to prosecutors was a businessman who would be killed. A union official who developed an inconvenient conscience was a union official who would be killed. A member of Lepke's own organization who became unreliable, who was drinking too much, talking too much, showing signs that he might eventually become a cooperation risk, was a member who would be killed. The murder decisions were made with the same organizational rigor that governed the rest of the enterprise. They were not made impulsively or emotionally. They were made when the calculations suggested that the risk posed by the living person exceeded the risk created by the act of killing them. This calculation was wrong, eventually, because it failed to account for the possibility that the organization itself might produce a cooperating witness, that one of the men who had participated in the murders might, when faced with his own prosecution, decide that his life was worth more than his silence. That possibility materialized in 1940, and when it did, it unraveled everything. By 1935, Louis Lepke Buchalter was at the apex of his power. He was generating income from multiple industries simultaneously, maintaining political protection that had prevented any serious law enforcement action against his core operations, and running a murder bureau that kept his enforcement problems permanently resolved. He was, in the estimation of the people who understood what he had built, the most powerful Jewish criminal figure in America. More powerful in operational terms than Meyer Lansky or any of his contemporaries. Because Lansky's financial genius operated in service of other people's enterprises, while Lepke's organizational genius operated in service of his own. The threat that eventually brought him down came from two directions almost simultaneously, and the interaction between them produced the specific catastrophe that followed. The first direction was Thomas Dewey. Thomas Dewey was a young federal prosecutor who who had made his reputation pursuing tax evasion cases against organized crime figures in the early 1930s, a method that had proven devastatingly effective because criminal organizations, almost by definition, do not report their income accurately to the Internal Revenue Service. In 1935, he was appointed as a special prosecutor for New York County by Governor Herbert Lehman, specifically tasked with investigating organized crime and official corruption. He was 33 years old, rigorously honest, relentlessly ambitious, and entirely immune to the political pressures that had protected Lepke and his contemporaries for years. Dewey's investigative methodology was systematic. He began with the industries Lepke controlled and worked backward to the control mechanisms. The union officials, the business agents, the enforcement operatives. He used immunity grants to turn witnesses who were themselves participants in the extortion schemes against the higher-level figures. He documented the money flows with the kind of financial forensics that left juries with concrete evidence rather than just witness testimony that could be attacked on credibility grounds. The first serious legal blow came in 1936, when Lepke and his partner Gura Shapiro were indicted on federal antitrust violations related to the fur industry, specifically the criminal restraint of trade through their control of the fur trucking operations. The antitrust theory was creative and somewhat untested, but it had the advantage of not requiring the testimony of victims who might be unwilling to testify for fear of retaliation. Lepke and Shapiro made bail and continued operating, but the federal indictment represented a qualitative change in the legal pressure they faced. In 1937, additional narcotics charges were added. The narcotics connection. Lepke had developed a heroin distribution operation as a side enterprise to his labor rackets. Importing narcotics through connections established through the broader crime syndicate gave federal prosecutors a different avenue of attack. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, under Harry Anslinger, was aggressively pursuing narcotics cases against organized crime figures, and Lepke's narcotics operations were documented well enough to support charges that carried substantial federal sentences. Facing multiple federal indictments and the continuing investigation by Dewey's office, Lepke made the decision that defined the next 3 years of his life. He went into hiding. The decision to disappear was not made impulsively. It was made with Lepke's characteristic careful calculation of costs and benefits, and in 1937 it seemed defensible. If he could remain out of reach long enough, perhaps the witnesses against him would become unavailable. Perhaps the political environment would shift. Perhaps some other development would reduce the legal pressure to a manageable level. He had experience with managing legal problems through political channels, and while the Dewey investigation was more insulated from political interference than anything he had previously faced, the instinct to wait and manage, rather than to confront, was deeply ingrained. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, was assigned to find him. Hoover's personal interest in the case was substantial. The Lepke case offered the opportunity to demonstrate the FBI's capability against organized crime in a high-profile context. The FBI investigation was intense and sustained over more than 2 years. Lepke hid in Brooklyn, in the Flatbush neighborhood, in apartments arranged by his remaining network. He moved periodically. He communicated through intermediaries. He continued, as much as possible, to manage his operations from hiding, receiving reports, giving instructions, making decisions about which of his escalating legal problems required which kinds of responses. The responses to his legal problems during the hiding period were increasingly characterized by the thing that would ultimately define his legacy beyond the labor rackets and the corruption: murder. Each time a potential witness was identified who might provide testimony against him in either the federal or state cases, the question of whether to kill that witness arose. In most cases, the answer was yes. The witnesses killed during Lepke's time in hiding were not all peripheral figures. Several were central participants in his operations who had either been approached by prosecutors or who Lepke had reason to believe might be approachable. Their deaths, professionally executed by the Murder Inc. apparatus that was still fully operational, temporarily removed the most immediate testimony threats. But they also created new problems. Each additional murder meant additional exposure, additional witnesses to the murders themselves, additional chains of evidence that might eventually reach Lepke. The FBI and the New York DA's office were methodical. They worked through the garment industry, the bakery associations, the trucking companies, building financial records, securing testimony from lower-level participants who faced their own prosecution, constructing the documentary evidence that would support the most serious charges. By 1939, the weight of the evidence against Lepke was such that the people around him who understood the legal situation were becoming seriously concerned that surrender or capture was inevitable, and that the earlier it happened, the better the bargaining position might be. The mechanism of Lepke's surrender was one of the stranger episodes in the history of American organized crime. The syndicate leadership, Lansky, Anastasia, and others, decided that Lepke's continued fugitive status was creating pressure on the entire organization, that the FBI's sustained pursuit was generating collateral damage in terms of investigations and arrests across the syndicate. They came to the conclusion that Lepke should give himself up. The negotiation of that surrender involved Walter Winchell, the newspaper columnist and radio personality, who was one of the most widely read and listened to journalists in America. Winchell had connections to both J. Edgar Hoover and to the New York underworld that made him a logical intermediary. The specific arrangement that Lepke would surrender to Hoover personally on the understanding that his federal case would be resolved before he was turned over to the state for the Dewey prosecution, was negotiated through Winchell with a degree of informality that is, in retrospect, extraordinary. On the evening of August 24, 1939, Lepke Buchalter got into a car driven by Albert Anastasia, was driven to a corner in Manhattan, walked to another car, and surrendered himself to J. Edgar Hoover. The surrender was managed to give Winchell the exclusive story. Hoover got the credit for the capture of the most wanted fugitive in America. Lepke got, or believed he was getting, a processing sequence that would give him the best possible legal outcome. What he got instead was a conviction on the federal narcotics charges that produced a 14-year federal sentence. Then, when the federal sentence was being served, he was turned over to Dewey's office for the state prosecution. The understanding that his surrender had bought him protection from the state case was, to the extent it had ever been a real promise, not honored. In 1941, Lepke Buchalter was convicted in New York State on extortion charges. He received 30 years to life. It was not the worst that was coming. The instrument of Lepke Buchalter's ultimate destruction was a small, violent, loquacious man from Brownsville named Abraham Reles. Abe Reles had been one of the operational supervisors of Murder Inc., one of the people who managed the day-to-day mechanics of the killing enterprise, who assigned contracts, supervised operatives, and ensured that the work was done correctly. He was not intellectually sophisticated, but he had an exceptional memory for operational detail and a physical courage that made him effective in his specific role. He was also, as it turned out, unwilling to die for the organization. When the alternative was cooperation, Reles was arrested in November 1940 on charges that carried serious time. He was facing, potentially, murder charges that could result in the death penalty. After some days of negotiation, with Kings County District Attorney William O'Dwyer's office as the primary counterparty, Reles agreed to cooperate. He had detailed knowledge of approximately 80 murders. He was prepared to provide testimony that would implicate Lepke directly in multiple homicides. The decision to cooperate was not a simple one for Reles. He was, by any accounting, fully aware of what cooperation with prosecutors meant in terms of his standing in the underworld, the men he would be testifying against, Lepke, Anastasia, and the broader Murder Inc. operation, had already demonstrated their willingness and capacity to kill people who became threats to the organization. Cooperating was, in a literal sense, a death warrant from his former associates. The only protection was the protection of the prosecution, and that protection was only as reliable as the integrity of the officials providing it. His testimony was extraordinarily detailed. He had, apparently, the kind of operational memory that some people who work in inherently dangerous environments develop. The ability to recall specifics of events because the stakes at the time demanded complete attention to detail. He could describe specific murders, who had ordered them, who had performed them, where they had occurred, how the bodies had been disposed of, with specificity that was difficult to fabricate, because it included details that could be corroborated independently. The testimony began to produce results immediately. Multiple Murder Inc. operatives were arrested and charged with homicides that Reles's testimony described. The state of the evidence, Reles's corroborated testimony, plus forensic evidence in cases where bodies had been found, plus financial records showing payments to the killers, was strong enough to obtain convictions. Several Murder Inc. members were executed at Sing Sing prison following convictions based on Reles's testimony. The case against Lepke himself was built methodically. Reles testified to multiple murders that Lepke had ordered, including the killing of a garment industry trucker named Joseph Rosen in September 1936. Rosen had been a small operator in the garment trucking business who had been squeezed out of his business by Lepke's organization and who had subsequently threatened to go to Dewey's office with what he knew about the trucking rackets. The threat was credible enough that Lepke ordered his elimination. Rosen was shot multiple times in his candy store in Brooklyn. The Rosen murder was the specific case that eventually resulted in Lepke's death sentence. The evidence, Reles's testimony, corroborated by the testimony of several other cooperating witnesses, established Lepke's role in ordering the killing with sufficient specificity to support a first-degree murder conviction under New York law. Lepke was tried for the Rosen murder in 1944. He was convicted. He was sentenced to death during the trial and in the years of appeals that followed. Lepke did something that was almost without precedent in the history of organized crime. He tried to trade information for his life. He offered to cooperate with prosecutors, to provide testimony about the inner workings of the National Crime Syndicate, about the political corruption that had sustained his operation, about the specific individuals involved in specific crimes, in exchange for commutation of his death sentence to life imprisonment. The negotiations over what Lepke knew and what it was worth were extended and ultimately unsuccessful. The problem was not that Lepke lacked information. By all accounts, what he knew was significant and would have been enormously valuable to prosecutors. The problem was that the information he was prepared to provide implicated people whose political connections were powerful enough to ensure that his offers were never seriously entertained. The people Lepke was said to be prepared to implicate included figures in the Democratic Party structure, in the labor movement, and in the legitimate business community who were not figures that prosecutors with political ambitions were eager to pursue. The specific details of what Lepke offered and why the offers were not accepted remain disputed. Some researchers believe his information was genuine and its suppression a product of political interference. Others believe his offers were exaggerated as a bargaining tactic and never contained enough specifics to produce actionable cases. What is clear is that no deal was made. The appeals process extended Lepke's life for several years after the initial 1944 sentence. He made multiple appeals to the governor of New York, first Thomas Dewey, who had become governor after his prosecutorial career, and then his successor, arguing that his cooperation offers had been improperly refused and that his execution would deprive the state of valuable intelligence about organized crime. The appeals were denied. On March 4, 1944, Abe Reles had been defenestrated from the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, where he was being held under police protection. The 6 police detectives assigned to protect him had, somehow, all been away from his room when he fell, or was thrown from the window. He died on the street below. The death of the star witness created enormous problems for the prosecution case and eliminated from the living record the most detailed account of Murder Inc.'s operations. Reles's death was never officially classified as murder, and no one was ever charged in connection with it. The detectives assigned to protect him were never criminally prosecuted, though several were subsequently the subject of departmental proceedings. The killing, for that is what the preponderance of evidence suggests it was, represented either the last major operation of the Murder Inc. apparatus or an act of corrupt law enforcement officials, or some combination of both. The loss of Reles did not ultimately save Lepke. The Rosen murder case had been built with enough corroboration from other witnesses that it survived Reles's death. The appeals were exhausted. The cooperation offers were rejected. On March 4, 1944, exactly 3 years after Reles died, Louis Lepke Buchalter walked into the execution chamber at Sing Sing prison and sat down in the electric chair. He was 47 years old. He was the only boss-level organized crime figure in American history to be executed by the state. He made a brief statement insisting that he had never been given the opportunity to tell what he knew. The switch was thrown. The execution of Lepke Buchalter in March 1944 did not end the world he had built. It changed who controlled it and what they called it, but the fundamental systems, the labor racketeering model, the murder bureau, the political corruption infrastructure, continued to operate under new management. The most immediate consequence of Lepke's prosecution and imprisonment was the transfer of his labor racket operations to figures within the Italian-American crime families who had been junior partners in the arrangements during his peak years. The garment industry, the trucking operations, the construction trades. All of these became, over the course of the 1940s, increasingly dominated by the Italian-American families, particularly the Luces and Gambino organizations. whose leadership had the organizational capacity and the political connections to absorb the infrastructure Lepke had built. This transfer was not a discontinuous break. The specific relationships between the crime organization and the union officials, between the criminal tribute and the political protection payments, between the enforcement apparatus and the industries it controlled, were institutional rather than personal. They persisted across the change in personnel because they were embedded in structures that had their own logic and their own self-reinforcing incentives. The garment industry manufacturers who had been paying Lepke's organization continued paying whoever inherited Lepke's organization, because the alternative was still the same. Disruption, violence, loss of business. The murder bureau underwent a different kind of transformation: the prosecution of Murder Inc. operatives. Raylers's testimony had produced multiple convictions before his death, and subsequent investigations had continued the process, significantly depleted the organization's operational capacity. By the late 1940s, the specific Murder Inc. apparatus, as an organized entity with a defined management structure and a client base, no longer functioned in the form Lepke had created. Its individual elements, the experienced killers who had survived prosecution, continued to operate, but as contractors to specific crime families, rather than as an independent service provider to the national syndicate. The national syndicate itself, the organization of Italian-American and Jewish crime families that had emerged from the Atlantic City Conference and the subsequent agreements, continued to develop through the 1940s and 1950s in ways that reflected, at every stage, the institutional patterns Lepke had pioneered. The Commission, the ruling body of the Italian-American organized crime structure, formalized exactly the kind of dispute resolution and resource allocation functions that had been informal in the Lepke era. The labor racketeering model was extended to new industries: construction, waterfront loading, waste hauling, food distribution. The political corruption model was replicated in city after city as the syndicate expanded its geographic scope. The specific impact of Lepke's labor racketeering model on the American labor movement is one of the most uncomfortable aspects of this history, and it is one that historians have not always addressed with the directness it deserves. The corruption of trade unions by organized crime was not, in every case, an imposition by external criminal forces on a resistant labor movement. In many cases, the specific cases documented in the Lepke prosecutions, and the many subsequent cases that followed the same pattern, the corruption was a collaboration between criminal organizations and labor officials who were themselves seeking to convert their organizational positions into personal financial benefit. The criminal organization provided enforcement capacity and political protection. The labor officials provided access to union structures and the cover of legitimate organizational functions. The workers, who were the nominal beneficiaries of the union's advocacy, were the people who got nothing from either party to this arrangement. This is not a critique of the labor movement as such. The labor movement of the 1930s and 1940s produced real gains for working people in industries and cities where it was not corrupted. The National Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the expansion of collective bargaining rights. These were genuine achievements, secured at genuine cost by genuinely committed organizers. The corruption that Lepke and his successors embedded in the industries they controlled was a parasite on a legitimate institution, not a description of that institution's nature, but the parasite had lasting effects. the industries that were most deeply penetrated by organized crime, garments, construction, the waterfront, waste hauling, were also the industries in which the labor movement's reputation suffered most severely, in which the association between union power and criminal corruption became most embedded in public consciousness. The specific perceptions of unions as vehicles for corruption and personal enrichment that continue to shape American politics in the 21st century are not unconnected to the specific cases. Lepke's cases, and the many cases that followed, in which the corruption was real and documented, the political aftermath of the Lepke prosecutions was similarly complex. The exposure of Tammany Hall's involvement in protecting Lepke's operations contributed to the political decline of the Tammany machine, which lost its grip on New York City Democratic politics in the late 1940s and 1950s. Fiorello LaGuardia's 3 terms as mayor, 1934 to 1945, precisely overlapping with the Dewey prosecutions and the Murder Inc. exposure, were in part a product of the public revulsion at the corruption that the Lepke case documented. The reform politics that LaGuardia represented were, at least partially, a reaction to the specific failures of the political system that Lepke had exploited. The careers of the prosecutors who pursued Lepke illustrated the long-term political consequences of the case in a different way. Thomas Dewey became governor of New York in 1942 and twice ran for president of the United States in 1944 and 1948. William O'Dwyer, the Brooklyn DA who supervised the Murder Inc. prosecutions, became mayor of New York City in 1945. The Lepke prosecutions were credential-building exercises for both men, demonstrations of prosecutorial courage and effectiveness that translated directly into political capital. The irony of O'Dwyer's trajectory is particularly notable. He had prosecuted Murder Inc. He had built his political career on that prosecution. And then, as mayor of New York, he was accused by subsequent investigations, most notably the Kefauver Committee investigation of organized crime in the early 1950s, of having maintained improper relationships with organized crime figures during his time as mayor, and of having been connected to the circumstances surrounding Abe Reles's death. He resigned from the mayoralty under this pressure in 1950 and was appointed ambassador to Mexico by President Truman, effectively removing him from the jurisdiction of the Senate investigation. The Reles death remained a permanent shadow over the prosecutorial record. The fact that the star witness against the remaining Murder Inc. leadership, including Albert Anastasia, who was never prosecuted for his role in running the Murder Bureau, because the primary witness against him died out a hotel window, had died under the protection of police officers who were never charged with anything, was a running indictment of the integrity of the system that had nominally brought justice to Lepke. Anastasia himself continued to operate in organized crime until 1957, when he was killed in a barbershop in the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. The men who killed him were never identified. The motive was related to internal crime family disputes of the period. His role in Murder Inc. and his responsibility for the deaths the organization had committed was never the subject of a successful prosecution. The broader lesson of these trajectories: Lepke executed, Anastasia killed by his own world's logic, O'Dwyer in diplomatic exile. The Murder Inc. operatives who weren't killed scattered across the federal prison system, is that the specific enterprise Lepke built was destroyed, but the destruction was partial, and the systems that sustained it were more durable than the individuals who had operated them. 50 years after Lepke Buchalter's execution, the patterns he established were still operational in the industries he had first penetrated. The specific personnel were different, the organizational names were different, and the political context had shifted significantly. But the essential model, criminal control of labor unions, extraction of tribute from industries through labor leverage, political corruption as an insulating mechanism, was recognizably continuous with what Lepke had built. The Senate investigations of organized crime that began with the Kefauver Committee in 1950 and continued with the McClellan Committee in the late 1950s. The investigations that introduced to the American public the terms mafia and La Cosa Nostra, and that made Robert Kennedy's reputation as a crime fighter, were investigating systems that Lepke had pioneered. The specific witnesses, Johnny Torrio, Frank Costello, the various Teamsters officials who appeared before McClellan, were operating within institutional structures that had their origins in the arrangements Lepke made in the garment lofts of the Lower East Side, the construction industry in New York City, which became one of the primary venues for organized crime labor racketeering in the post-war period, operated on an almost identical model to Lepke's garment industry racket. The crime families controlled the unions that organized construction workers. The unions provided labor peace or disruption to contractors depending on their compliance with the tribute arrangements. The tribute supported the political corruption that protected the arrangements from law enforcement. The model worked because the underlying logic was sound. The only people who could disrupt it were the workers themselves and the workers' organizational capacity. Their union had been captured. The docks, the New York waterfront, were the most famous example of the post-Lepke application of his model, made famous by Elia Kazan's 1954 film on the waterfront. The film presented a somewhat romanticized account of the problem, but the underlying reality it described: criminal control of a labor union, systematic extortion of longshoremen and shipping companies, violence against workers who tried to resist, was exactly the Lepke model applied to the shipping industry. The Teamsters Union, under Dave Beck and then Jimmy Hoffa, represented the national-scale elaboration of the same pattern. Hoffa's relationship with organized crime figures, particularly those in the Detroit and Cleveland mob families, was the relationship of a union leader who understood that criminal protection could be traded for union stability in ways that benefited both parties. The benefit to the criminal side was access to the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, which became one of the most significant sources of organized crime financing in American history. The benefit to Hoffa was that the mob's enforcement capacity made organizing drives in contested industries more effective than purely legal approaches could have been. The question of what this history means for understanding the specific intersection of Jewish organized crime and American capitalism is one that has been treated with varying degrees of directness in the historical literature. The Jewish organized crime figures of the 1920s and 1930s, Rothstein, Lepke, Lansky, Siegel, the members of Murder Inc., were products of a specific historical moment. The concentrated poverty of the immigrant Lower East Side, the systematic exclusion of Jewish Americans from the legitimate professional and business world, the Ivy League quotas, the restrictive covenants, the law firm exclusions, and the specific geography of Jewish settlement in New York City that created densely networked communities in which criminal organizations could develop alongside and intertwined with legitimate community institutions. The prominence of Jewish figures in the early organized crime world was not a reflection of any cultural or genetic predisposition toward criminality. It was a reflection of the specific circumstances of immigrant Jewish life in early 20th century America, the concentration of economic energy in a constrained geographic and occupational space, the availability of the specific skills, organizational thinking, financial calculation, legal sophistication that the families of Jewish immigrants had developed through centuries of operating in constrained circumstances in Europe, and the systematic exclusion from legitimate channels of advancement that made illegitimate channels more attractive. Lepke Buchalter was, in this context, an extreme version of a phenomenon that was broadly characteristic of his time and place. He was a person of considerable intelligence and organizational capability who operated in an environment that offered, for someone of his background and circumstances, very limited legitimate paths to the kind of success his intelligence and ambition warranted. The path he took was catastrophic in its human consequences: the murders, the corruption, the exploitation of workers through the very unions that were supposed to protect them. But the path existed, and people of his generation took it. And the fact that it existed tells you something about the society that produced it. The Jewish organized crime world that Lepke inhabited did not survive the mid-20th century in anything like its original form. The second and third generations of Jewish Americans were, unlike the first, not systematically excluded from legitimate professional and business life. The post-war expansion of the university system, the GI Bill, the gradual erosion of the most formal exclusions, and the broader prosperity of the post-war American economy created legitimate paths to the kind of success that the criminal world had offered to the immigrant generation. The children of the immigrants became lawyers, doctors, academics, business executives. They did not become gangsters, for the most part, because they had better options. The Italian-American crime families that inherited the labor racketeering infrastructure Lepke built lasted significantly longer, in some cases, into the 21st century, because the specific social dynamics that supported them were more durable. The eventual decline of the Italian-American organized crime world, documented by the RICO prosecutions of the 1980s and 1990s that followed the Kefauver and McClellan investigations' legislative legacy, was the product of the same forces: improved, legitimate opportunities for the community. The demographic dispersal of the urban ethnic neighborhoods that had sustained the organizational infrastructure and the sustained application of federal law enforcement resources. The story of Lepke Buchalter and Murder Inc. has never been given the full dramatic treatment it deserves, in the specific way that The Godfather or Goodfellas or The Sopranos treated the stories of Italian-American organized crime. The reasons for this are several and somewhat interlocking. The specific Jewish character of the story creates narrative complications for filmmakers. Conscious of how depictions of Jewish criminality have been used historically, the industrial nature of the enterprise, labor racketeering is less cinematically vivid than bootlegging or drug dealing, is harder to dramatize. The systematic nature of the corruption implicates institutions rather than just individuals, and institutional critique is harder to sustain for 2 hours than individual character drama. But the story deserves to be told because it is true, and because the patterns it documents are not historical curiosities. The intersection of criminal organizations, labor unions, and political corruption that Lepke pioneered has appeared, in updated forms, in multiple industries and multiple countries throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, understanding how it works, how the incentives align, how the institutions are captured, how the violence is organized and deployed, how the political protection is purchased and maintained, is necessary for understanding how to recognize and resist it when it appears. Louis Lepke Buchalter was executed on March 4, 1944. The last statement he made, insisting that he had never been given the chance to tell what he knew, was probably true. What he knew about the specific mechanisms of corruption, the specific names of the officials who had been purchased, the specific operations of the National Crime Syndicate, went with him into the electric chair. What he built lived on. The industries he had penetrated took decades to clean up. Some of them never fully did. The model he had developed, control the labor, control the supply chain, buy the politics, kill the problems, was the most consequential contribution to American organized crime made by any figure in the first half of the 20th century. It is too dark for Netflix because the darkness is not confined to the criminal side of the story. It is in the police departments that took the money. It is in the union offices where officials traded their members' interests for personal safety and personal gain. It is in the governor's mansion where the cooperation offers went unanswered, and in the hotel room where the witness fell, and in the boardrooms where the manufacturers wrote the checks and told themselves it was just the cost of doing business. The darkness is everywhere you look, once you know where to look. That is exactly why the story needs to be told. Louis Lepke Buchalter, born February 6, 1897, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, executed March 4, 1944, at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. The architect of Murder, Inc., the most powerful Jewish gangster in American history. The only organized crime boss executed by the state, and the man whose methods defined organized crime in America for the next half-century. Now you know what Netflix didn't want to tell you. Big Pop's texture. Everything else followed from it.